No refuge for enemies in Hezbollah strongholds. Israel's warning after bombing a residential suburb of Beirut. Dozens of people have been killed, including top commanders of the group. So what does this mean for Hezbollah and the region? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. An Israeli explosion has rocked southern Beirut, crossing another so-called red line for Hezbollah. The killing of senior commanders as well as civilians is a major breach of security for the group. A nation already on edge for years, its foreign minister told an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council that nobody is safe. With Israel diverting focus and forces to the north, is it preparing a ground invasion for what it calls a second phase of the war on Gaza? How much of a blow is all this to Hezbollah? And is the region already at war? We'll put those questions to our guests shortly, along with many others. But first, this report from Imad Mugir.
3 major attacks on Lebanon in 4 days. The latest, an airstrike in a densely populated suburb in South Beirut, killing over a dozen people. One was Ibrahim Akil, one of the most senior commanders in Hezbollah's elite Radwan forces. That came after dozens of people were killed and thousands injured when pagers and then walkie-talkies exploded across Lebanon on Tuesday and Wednesday. The target of the attacks, members of Hezbollah, but members of the public were also victims, including children.
Isn't this terrorism when you target a whole population in their cities, markets and homes while they tend to their daily life, while they're not fighting on the front? Are we seeking today the annihilation of the Lebanese people? It's collective punishment.
Since the start of Israel's war on Gaza last October, Hezbollah has launched rocket attacks into northern Israel and exchanged fire with Israeli forces across Lebanon's southern border, declaring its support for Hamas and Palestinians in the Strip. In a special appearance at the Security Council, the Lebanese foreign minister reminded the UN that during the past year of conflict, Israel has threatened to send Lebanon back to the Stone Age. The UN declared this week's attacks using communication devices in Lebanon a violation of international law, carried out without regard for its civilian population.
International humanitarian law prohibits the use of booby-trap devices in the form of apparently harmless portable objects which are specifically designed and constructed to contain explosive material. It is a war crime to commit violence intended to spread terror among civilians.
Israel has admitted carrying out the airstrike in Beirut and has continued to make threats.
If Hezbollah does not retreat from our border and back to the north of the Litani River through diplomatic efforts, Israel will be left with no choice but to use any means within our rights to defend our citizens.
Israel's army has moved troops to its northern border with Lebanon in what commanders are calling the second phase of the war on Gaza. The latest attacks are a major blow to Hezbollah and have exposed weaknesses in its security apparatus. The group's leader Hassan Nasrallah has promised revenge, and rockets fired from southern Lebanon have since struck the north of Israel, followed by Israel also sending rockets across the border. People across Lebanon are living in fear of what might come next, while the UN spokesperson said the region is on the brink of catastrophe. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss all of this further with today's guests on Inside Story. In Athens, we have Nicholas No. He's editor-in-chief of Beirut-based MiddleEastWire.com. In Beirut, Sami Nader, director of the Levant Institute for Strategic Affairs. And in London, Samuel Ramani, Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute Middle East Programme. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us today on Inside Story. I'd like to go to you first, Sami, because you are there in Beirut. We know the trauma that Lebanese people have suffered in recent years, economic collapse, that port explosion in 2020 that killed more than 200 people. Tell me what the atmosphere is there this week after all of these events. How are people coping?
I mean, the atmosphere is that of deep anxiety and fear. Because, as you mentioned, Lebanon is still going through an unprecedented economic and financial crisis. The Lebanese pound has lost 98% of its value. This is on one side. And on the other side, I mean, the Lebanese people have still in their fresh memory the Beirut port blast tragedy and the havoc that that was the result. Plus, they still have in mind the 2006 war and its devastating impact on the Lebanese infrastructure, on the Lebanese economy. So they don't want to go through this kind of tragedy again. So the moment is a moment of fear. It's a moment of anxiety, especially that things are going through an escalation track. It's true that we are not into a full-blown war, but we are on the very edge of it.
Sami, Sami, many of the people, of course, do not have the money or the means to leave Lebanon. But people you speak to, are there people now thinking it's time, maybe, if they have a visa, to get out of the country?
Definitely, especially among the youth. The only thing that they want is to look for new horizon, for security first. And what we have been witnessing recently, that this was not only among the youth, but even the people of third age, because they are looking for their own security. They lost their saving in the banks, and now they are about to lose their homes once more.
Samuel, let's get your view on how serious is this moment in your judgment? How close are we to a full-blown regional war?
Well, I think that over the past year, Hezbollah and Israel have operated basically under a set of unwritten ground rules, where effectively they would retaliate tit for tat across the border, but refrain from any kind of massive escalation that would lead to a repeat of what we saw in 1982 or 2006. And from officials and experts in Washington who I was speaking to over the past several months, they were fairly confident that that status quo would remain intact. But over the past week or so, I think that we have seen now a heightened risk of escalation. Of course, it's still possible that Israel's strikes on Hezbollah targets, which have been paired with the attacks on Syria that killed 18 people 2 weeks ago, and the attack on Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq just over the past several hours, the Iraqi proxy militia, and the threats to retaliate against the hypersonic missile strike from Yemen could be just aimed at deterring Iran's proxies from further escalation. But I think that the risk of an accidental war is rising highly, because if Hezbollah responds in a more forceful way than Israel anticipates, then Israel could see this as the casus belli for a bigger conflict. So I think that both sides have been trying to keep this in check, but the risk of a misperception or an accident or an unintendedly large escalation that one side does not deem to be proportionate taking root is very, very high right now.
Nicholas, let me ask you to look back on the week's events. So we've had bombs hidden in pagers, bombs hidden in walkie-talkies, and then a major bombing in the southern suburbs. How do you assess the damage to Hezbollah from those various events that we've seen in recent days?
Well, I think the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, said it, and it's been said by a number of their allies and partisans and analysts. This is probably collectively the hardest hit that Hezbollah has had militarily, perhaps ever, since its founding decades ago. Certainly the strike yesterday, the largest concentration of key leaders, and these are really generational leaders, founders of the organization, all together in one strike, is unprecedented and is a very heavy blow for the organization. But I think in contrast to what your guest just said, if we look at it collectively over these days, I don't think that one can say reasonably that Israel is trying to keep things in check. It's obvious that they are going for a much more heightened set of military strikes on Hezbollah and on Lebanon much more widely than the previous, let's say, 10, 11 months. They view, I think, an opportunity where Hezbollah clearly does not want to go towards open war at this point. The Israelis thus feel that because Hezbollah's counterstrikes on them have had very limited import, that this is an opportune moment to try and, as widely as possible, push Hezbollah militarily with various strikes, including huge mass casualty attacks like we've seen with the walkie-talkie attacks and the pager attacks. So I think that actually the Israelis look as if they are, and they will continue to significantly raise the bar of their strikes. And I think that, unfortunately, we're not in an accidental war sort of scenario here. We're on a very clear path towards an open war. And let's be clear that the major reason, although there are many historical factors and structural factors, but the primary, most immediate reason is the failure to get a durable ceasefire in Gaza and in the war over Gaza. And that is the number one thing that is leading us towards what will not be an accident, but very much a sort of clear pathway, a slippery slope if you want, but a clear pathway nonetheless towards a much wider war, and one that will be immensely destructive for Lebanon and also immensely destructive for Israel as well.
Sami, the attacks we've seen this week, clearly Hezbollah's communications are going to be damaged by this. Its commanders, some have died, so its command of its forces is going to be damaged. But just put this all in perspective, because this is a very large organisation with a vast arsenal of weaponry and drones and missiles and a very large number of well-trained fighters.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the blow they have taken is substantial, and one could raise the question whether Hezbollah still have the capability to keep on this escalation track, and whether it has the capabilities to sustain a full-blown war. It's true that Hezbollah said it clearly that they don't want a war, that they are ready to stop the battle with a ceasefire in Gaza, but they are prepared for it. So after the event of the last day, one raises a question about their readiness for this war. And all the more, Hezbollah and Nasrallah himself has acknowledged the technological supremacy of Israel. So, and this war in particular, that of 2023, is different from that of 2006. It's highly technological, and then here you have ideology versus technology. And it's clear that those who have the technology supremacy got today the upper hand. And this event shows how much the military system of Hezbollah is exposed, is vulnerable, and has been infiltrated by Israel secret services. And despite this, I mean, Nasrallah yesterday voted to continue the battle, to link what the war he is waging, this war of support, on what's happening in Gaza. But keeping in mind that we are not anymore in this tit for tat type of war. We are into a direct war. It's true that it did not cross the final line to throw the country into a blown war, but we are getting there. And,
OK, let me just focus on those that have died in terms of the Hezbollah command structure, because two commanders, one was Ahmed Wabi, but perhaps the most significant of those that were died, Ibrahim Akil, was one of Hezbollah's most senior military leaders and a member of the Jihad Council, its highest military body. He was wanted in the US in connection with his role in the 1983 bombings in Beirut of the US embassy that killed 63 people, and a US Marine Corps barracks in which 241 American personnel died. Akil's assassination is the second of a leading Hezbollah military figure in Beirut in less than 2 months. In July, an Israeli airstrike killed the group's top military commander, Fuad Shukar. So, Nicholas, just bring us a spotlight briefly on Ibrahim Akil. How important was he in the command structure of Hezbollah?
Well, one is that, talking about the internal command structure of Hezbollah by anyone outside and analysts like us is extremely fraught. I think what we know from the public reporting and what's been acknowledged by Hezbollah is that he played, and the others that were killed as well yesterday, and obviously in the past days and weeks, played key roles. These are the main components of their highest, most secretive leadership council. It's also, I think, really important to look at it as a huge generational shift through them being taken off the battlefield through assassination. By the way, it's not just these figures in the last few days and weeks that have been assassinated. There's a long litany of Hezbollah key foundational, founding figures that have been taken off the battlefield. Most notably, Imad Mugir in 2008 in an assassination in Damascus. But there have been many others, Badruddin and many others, Hassan Lais, etc. So what you have now is you have a 45-year-old or 40-year-old organization that has been through a tremendous amount of military and political conflicts. And what you're seeing is really the kind of founding membership, the founding leaders, a significant amount, it seems, have been assassinated and taken off the battlefield. Now, we can say that on the one hand, and it's very hard to assess again from the outside. But on the other hand, I would disagree with Sami respectfully that, these kinds of attacks of the last few days and of the last few weeks, and even of the kind of assassinations of founding members kind of radically destabilizes or kind of leads Hezbollah almost to its collapse. I think this is an organization that's widely acknowledged to be extremely deep and organizationally very strong. And they have, over the last 10 years, especially since their involvement in the Syria war and the confrontation with ISIS and other Sunni jihadist groups, they have had a significant amount of battlefield training of new members coming through the ranks. And this is a very dynamic organization, as I think even its enemies will acknowledge. So yes, significant.
If I can bring in Samuel, Ibrahim Akil, who we've been talking about, had a US arrest warrant facing him. They were going to pay, if he had been captured, up to $7 million US. What do you think this, what will this have an effect, the fact that he was killed, on the US response to all of this?
Well, Ibrahim Akil certainly was an enemy number one for the Americans inside Lebanon. It wasn't just for the 1983 bombings in Beirut. It was also that Akil was allegedly linked to the taking of Americans and Germans as captives during the 1980s. And so this is obviously something that the Americans would probably cheer on. I mean, it's unclear exactly how powerful Akil was within the organization. We know that he was in Tazeen. We know he was close to Mugir. We've heard some reports that he's been involved in logistics, but this is a person who's never really given an interview. He's a shadowy figure. He hasn't really had much of a public role. Fuad Shukr, the other commander who was assassinated, for example, was more involved in the procurement of sophisticated weaponry for Hezbollah. So Akil was probably less involved in that. So I think that the U.S. would probably see this, obviously, as some kind of belated revenge and probably review it with a sigh of relief. But they'll probably be looking at the bigger picture here. And I think the Americans have been pretty consistent in their dialogue with the Israelis that they don't necessarily want an outbreak of a much larger war in Lebanon, particularly in tandem with the upcoming elections.
OK. Sami, when we look at these latest attacks this week, there have been large civilian death toll involved. And earlier on, Nicholas mentioned the targeting of Imad Mugir in 2008. Well, that was a targeted assassination. He was the only one who died. And yet so many innocent civilians have been killed this week. Do you think Israel is less concerned about international outrage and that there is a different measure by the Israelis? They calibrate this differently now after the war on Gaza.
Listen, Israel hasn't shown any type of concern when it comes to the civilian collateral damage. And we have seen that in Gaza. So why Lebanon would be different? And we have seen all the debates going on during the session at the International Justice Court and how Israel have been accused not to take any action to secure the civilians during its operation. And it's true that what happened for the last 4 days come at the detriment of the civilian. This is why a large swath of the Lebanese population, even though they fundamentally disagree with Hezbollah on its policy, on the fact that he's keeping the arms beside the Lebanese army, felt solidarity, deep solidarity with especially those civilians that paid the price of this war and considered the Israeli attack as a blow to Lebanon.
I think it's worth now looking at what Israel says it's doing. And last Monday, the Israeli cabinet changed its war objectives with regard to the war in Gaza, not only to free the Israeli captives and defeat Hamas, but to allow residents of the north to safely return to their homes. There seems to be, Nicholas, a new objective. Can this objective be achieved without Israel going in on the ground offensive, in your view?
Well, ground offensive is one thing, but also I think the more immediate calculation is kind of wider devastation of Hezbollah targets and Lebanese targets as well. And I think that that's what we're more likely to see. I think Israel recognizes, as U.S. unnamed officials have and Israeli unnamed officials have in the past few weeks, that a ground operation looks terrible for the Israelis. It does not look like a very good prospect for them. That said, the core issue, I think, is that Hezbollah, and Nasrallah said this in no uncertain terms the other day, Hezbollah is very unlikely to change its policy of military pressure linked to a durable ceasefire in Gaza. They are very unlikely to change that policy under attack. And indeed, I cannot imagine a scenario where Israeli kind of upping of these strategic and quote unquote targeted attacks, that somehow puts enough pressure on Hezbollah to relent. And thus that, citizens of the north in Israel can return to their homes. I highly doubt that course. That's why I think it's unfortunately more likely that the Israelis at some point, through a mixture of hubris over the last few days and weeks of the success of their attacks, as well as internal political pressure from northern residents and elsewhere, that they have to and they will expand their operations in Lebanon such that we reach a point where we are essentially in open warfare between Hezbollah and Lebanon and Israel.
OK. Of course, Samuel, the other factor in all of this is what Iran might do, because we still have Iran saying that, it said some time ago that it was going to retaliate for the assassination in Tehran of the Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh back on July the 31st. What's your view on how Iran is going to play things right now?
Well, obviously, there's been a tremendous amount of outrage coming through from the Iranian state media towards what Israel has done, especially in response to the pager attack and the injury that was wielded towards the Iranian ambassador inside Beirut. But it doesn't really remain clear whether Iran actually wants a full-blown regional war that would probably involve attacks on multiple fronts at once, including asymmetric airstrikes, right? Keep in mind that if the Israelis and the Iranians were to engage in that kind of conflict, you'd be probably seeing the Israelis carrying out more attacks on Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, against key military infrastructure inside Syria, where the Russians are already redeploying some of their air defense systems away to bring them to the Ukrainian theater, and also potentially inside Yemen. So I think that Iran definitely is showing a lot of solidarity right now with Hezbollah and with the Lebanese people, but I think it also is hedging its bets on whether it actually wants a full-blown war to be dragged in directly into it.
OK. So, Sami, I want you to sum up now what you think are any chances of diplomatic efforts. The US has an envoy, Amos Hochstein. He had a plan. He was trying to work a plan. But it seems to me the problem with his plan is Hezbollah at all stages has said that the war in Gaza must stop And Netanyahu doesn't seem to show any appetite for the other plan that the US are pushing, that deal to try and get a ceasefire in Gaza.
Definitely. I mean, the position of both parties are very far apart. On one hand, and in a nutshell, Hezbollah wants to keep the rules of engagement as it was prevailing on October 6, before October 7, and Israel is determined to change this equation, to change this rule of engagement in order to ensure the return of the residents of the North. So the likelihood of a diplomatic solution are not that high, especially nowadays. I mean, however, the option is still on the table, and with the consent of Hezbollah, for the simple fact that the Lebanese government has stated loud and clear, and yesterday he confirmed that at the United Nations, the Foreign Affairs Minister, that they are ready to implement the UN Resolution 1701, and this could not have happened without the consent of Hezbollah. So the exit for
I want to bring in
Hezbollah
Nicholas at the end one more time on the diplomacy. Nicholas, are you at all hopeful about where things stand right now?
Sadly, I'm not. I mean, you know, as an American and a longtime observer and involved in American politics, I think the core fact remains that the only power that can change Israel's calculations towards a durable ceasefire in the war in Gaza is the United States. And unfortunately, President Biden and his team are unwilling to bring the sort of pressure that would be necessary to get to that ceasefire, which would then effectively have a ceasefire in Lebanon, and all of the discussions that Sami just said about this UN Security Council resolution could then happen, negotiation, etc. But it would be within the context of an end of the war in Gaza and an end of the war between Israel and Hezbollah, or Israel and Lebanon. That, unfortunately, does not look forthcoming before the US presidential elections. And unfortunately, I'm very, let's say, bearish, if you will, that even after these elections, especially with Trump, but even with Harris, that we're going to find that kind of pressure to put on the Israelis. So without that durable ceasefire in the offing in the weeks and months ahead, I see it very difficult to avert a much higher level of confrontation, war, and unfortunately disaster for the peoples of the region.
Thank you very much indeed for a fascinating and rather depressing conversation. Our guests today, Nicholas No, Sami Nader and Samuel Ramani. Al Jazeera's comprehensive coverage continues with reporting from our teams in southern Lebanon, Beirut, Gaza and the West Bank, and full analysis on aljazeera.com. We want to hear from you too. Post your comments on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or alternatively, find us on X, where we are at AJ Inside Story. I'll be back here very soon. But from me for now and all the team, please stay safe and well. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.